Good evening. Thank you all for being here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Nicole Furlong. I'm professor and director of the Klingenstein Center for Independent School Leaders. Welcome to this evening's conversation among friends, in fact, two high school friends, among friends exploring identity, race, privilege, and belonging at boarding school and by extension, school writ large. The Klingenstein Center, for those of you who don't know, is the premier professional learning program for independent and international school educator leaders. From our beginning in 1977, we understood that professional growth positively impacts learning and leads to thriving students and schools. We grow the capacity of educators to lead in a time when rapid change is our constant, and the commitment to socially just and emotionally informed leadership is most urgent. Today, our nearly 4,000 alumni lead, create, design, and innovate in education across the globe. We are thrilled this evening to have Alex Tilney and Shamus Khan with us. Alex is the author of The Expectations, a novel that best-selling author Jennifer Egan proclaimed, quote, announces a dazzling new voice in American fiction. The novel follows Ben Weeks, a multi-generational legacy student and squash champion, and Ahmed Al-Khaled, the son of an extraordinarily wealthy Dubai sheik, as both boys try to survive their first year at an elite but struggling boarding school. The Expectations is at once a finely drawn portrait of American privilege and a subtle exploration of class, race, and tradition. Above all, it is a tender, sharp, and evocative debut about the pain and treachery of adolescence and the difficulty, wherever one finds oneself, of truly belonging. Alex is a graduate of the Warren Wilson College MFA program for writers and has been a fellow at the McDowell Colony. His writing has appeared in the Southwest Review, the Journal of the Office for Creative Research, and Guelph Magazine. He lives in Brooklyn with his partner, theater artist Sarah Hughes. Dr. Shamus Khan is chair and professor of sociology at Columbia University. His work primarily focuses on cultural sociology and stratification, with a strong focus on elites. Among many other publications, he is author of Privilege, The Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, and the forthcoming Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, with co-author Jennifer Hirsch. I am particularly excited about this program tonight because it amplifies fiction's potential in professional learning programs in spaces like schools of education, health, and psychology, as Teachers College is. With fiction, we grapple, explore, and discuss complex issues. Fiction allows us a unique space to practice for the lives we lead in service of the students and school communities we serve. Fiction allows a slowed-down opportunity to witness our schools as the complex, socializing institutions they are, and given that fact, a space to think as educators and citizens about how we might be more intentional about that socialization. Please join me in welcoming Alex Tilney and Shamus Khan to the Klingenstein Center and to Teachers College.
First, I just want to thank the Klingenstein Center and Nicole especially for having me, Shamus for appearing with me. And just, I can't tell you how much I appreciate that specific, thoughtful assessment of the role of fiction. I think both, hopefully in this context and just in the culture at large, that slowing down and that opportunity to look at the lived experience of our life. I just also want to thank everyone for coming. Writing a book can be a very lonely experience. It took me 9 years to write this one. And promoting a book can also be a very lonely experience. Excuse me. And so the opportunity to be here in person with you, looking you in the face, breathing the same air is extraordinarily welcome. So thank you so much. So I'm going to read a passage from the book. Because we are here on a dark November evening, I thought I would read a passage that takes place in late summer. At a very beautiful place in New Hampshire. Just to set this up, Nicole, thank you so much for giving the sort of principal actors here. Ben Weeks whose family did help start the school but has now gone bankrupt and can't pay his tuition. Ahmed Al-Khaled, this very wealthy student from Dubai. The three other people you'll need to know for this section are Alice, who's an older student who Ben has just met, who he's taken quite a liking to, and Hutch and Evan, two sort of friends slash frenemies of Ben's. We are starting on the boat docks at this school, a non-functioning dock that goes down into the water set aside specifically for students to swim from. And we start in Alice's point of view as she is looking to her one side at Ben. He was too unsure to fill out his looks, but Alice knew that soon he'd get over his self-consciousness. Soon he'd build up some ease. He'd get a few quizzes back and realize he could hang with the work. He'd see girls smile to him after seated meal, even if his joke wasn't so funny. Whatever team he was on would win a few games. He would wear his shoes the right way. And then he'd disappear into that ease. Alice had seen so many of them make the same change, from glowing with discomfort along the walls of a dance, or drifting back from the football fields under planetary helmets, to folding into the language, draping themselves across the chairs in the dining hall common room, hooting and shouting when a group dared each other to say penis, each louder than the last, going with the hunch that if they leaned in to kiss that girl, she would likely reciprocate. They would launch into speaking during class, trusting that cogency would emerge along the way, letting the act of talking itself lend shape to their thoughts. She could almost feel it happening in Ben, moment by moment there beside her. She wished, occasionally, that she could break off a piece of this confidence, sneak up on one of them and snip it off like a lock of hair. Alice looked again at Ahmed, then returned her eyes to Ben. Did he really have two servants helping him set up his room? You know about that? Everyone knows about that. Ben suddenly was convinced that Ahmed had overheard them, but when he turned to check, Ahmed was looking the other way at a few other kids who were just coming up the steps to the dock. Oh well, you win some, you lose some, she said. How'd you chip your tooth? A holly noob is a quiet noob, he said. She didn't laugh. Hutch and Evan had been hanging onto the side of the dock, but now they pushed off and swam in a group with the older kids. The pack of them headed farther out diagonally from the left front corner of the dock. As they moved through the water, they gave the expanse a human scale, and Ben was aware of the volume of air across the entire pond. The group slowed down, spread out, then seemed to move in insistent, slow zigzags. Finally, one of them stopped with an abruptness that didn't seem possible in open water and shouted something. The rest of them swam to him as he seemed buoyed up with his back toward the sky. Then, unbelievably, he straightened up until he was standing out of the surface of the water, covered only to his lower ankles. Well, the Jesus rock has been discovered again for the first time, said Alice. Now 4 of the older kids were standing up in the water, not Hutch or Evan yet. The kids huddled close together, and the surface of the rock looked to be about as big as the top of a large refrigerator. They shivered even in the warm air, so near to each other with so much open skin. Finally, Ben shifted and reached for his towel. I'm jumping in. He looked over to Alice. Anyone else? Go ahead, Alice said. Ben stood up and wriggled out of his shirt, desperate to bury himself in the water so that neither Alice nor anyone else would see his pallor and his thinness. He had a passing image of himself as the ball chain hanging down from a ceiling lamp. He wanted to run full speed, but the uneven planking was too steeply sloped, and here and there a nailhead jutted up, so he had to walk down to the end of the dock through the burning of his visibleness. Finally, he leaned into a short, slow dive, crunching into the water, streaming through, the flesh between his toes distinct as the liquid passed over it, then turning over to emerge on his back. He saw everyone facing him from the dock, and it looked like they were spectating his swim. For a second, he wondered whether Alice would be impressed that he was swimming, and then realized how stupid that was. He lay back into a kind of modified backstroke. The water was just perfect, almost the same temperature as his skin, and for a moment it was hard to tell where his body ended. He looked up at the skeins of cloud set absolutely still across the sky. He felt good. After the upper formers had had their fill of climbing up on the rock and jumping off, they swam back to the dock to sit in the sun again, and the rock became available to noobs. Hutch and Evan were the first, and they stood up there and presented their chests and set their fists on their hips and looked up into the brave future like mountaineers posing for a summit photograph. Ben looked back to the dock, and his eyes met Ahmed's for an instant. He immediately regretted it. It was as though the impact of his gaze had lifted Ahmed to his feet. Ahmed came down to the end of the dock, still with his t-shirt and shoes on. His torso looked like a cake decorator's icing bag. Ben realized he had been convinced Ahmed couldn't swim. Without taking off his shoes or shirt, Ahmed leapt into the water with his arms reaching out in front of him as though bracing for a fall, and then his head came above the surface of the water and he started wriggling forward. His face had the determined look of someone cleaning something foul. Ben rolled over and took several hard strokes toward the rock with his eyes closed, then picked his head up and saw he was a few feet off course. He corrected his direction and took several more strokes, hoping to get out there before Ahmed could come close. Hutch and Evan were still the only ones up on the rock. The sun reached a place that was suddenly late afternoon, and Ben looked across the water to the library and the chapel, glowing their different shades of umber. He swam to the edge of the rock, looking up at the two other boys, the water turning their blonde hair dark, both of them with the first long hairs starting to grow off their chests. They cleared a space for Ben. He set his hands on the top surface of the rock and started to twist his way up, and Evan took him by the upper arm as he came to standing. Ben steadied himself. He could just see the lighter surface of the rock below the water, and it was slick enough under his feet that he had to keep his knees bent to hold his balance. He looked around at the black plain all around him and the surrounding trees. Despite Ben's repelling him with his mind, Ahmed swam implacably to them. As he came closer, all three of them turned to face him. He reached the rock and set his hands on the edge. He was breathing hard but not panicked, and Ben wondered whether this was the farthest he'd ever swum. Had he ever been outside a pool? "I love swimming," he said, looking up to them a little too out of breath to smile. Hutch and Evan laughed, and Ahmed now smiled through his breathing, but Ben could see that he knew Hutch and Evan's laughter wasn't kind. Ahmed pulled his chest to the side of the rock and leaned into his hands to begin to climb up. "No noobs," said Evan. "Sorry," said Ahmed, looking up in the middle of his effort. "He said no noobs," Hutch said, "especially no spoiled brat noobs." "You are new." "Your servant's going to carry you up here?" said Evan. "You going to buy the Jesus rock all for yourself?" said Hutch. "Maybe build some condos on it, some timeshares, maybe a casino, maybe a mall?" Ahmed laughed a laugh with no humor, only shrugging off what they had said, and he went again to climb up. With his foot, Hutch reached out and pushed Ahmed's right hand away from the rock. Just before Ben's foot moved to nudge Ahmed's other hand away, Evan had already done it. Ben could still, in his imagination, almost feel the softness of his skin meeting Ahmed's, and he suddenly worried that Alice would see them being mean to him. Ben expected Ahmed to look up at him with supplication, but Ahmed didn't look up at all, and instead just pushed off gently and began to wriggle back toward the dock. As Ben looked up, he saw the gray-blue fingernail of Alice's sweatshirt move out of sight around the side of the boathouse. Thank you so much.
So I think Alex and I had talked about having a conversation for a little bit and then sort of quickly opening it up to you all. And I want to begin with like the decision to write a book about sort of elites and privilege in this moment, and sort of how you thought through doing that, why you wanted to do it.
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I think this calls out something that first of all, I realize that I'm going that way, and my microphone is this way. Can everyone hear if I'm talking this direction? Good. So I always see this thing where a book comes out, and it happens to be timed in a certain cultural moment. but books take so long to write that that's almost always an accident. And as I said before, this book took me 9 years to write, and so I had utterly no idea about the future. And in fact, I almost started writing this book by accident. So I was trying to write things that were much more sophisticated, much cooler than books about teenagers in the 1990s. All of those projects were terrible. And as sort of a break from writing those terrible projects, I would sort of remember these things from going to school and how strange they seemed. Why kids in the 1990s of a certain type liked the Grateful Dead so much, why Tivas were so cool. And sort of start writing those things because they felt very delicious and they had a lot of pleasure in them. And then that took on more and more momentum, and I made the mistake of making it my main project and then spent 9 years on it. And so I think what I intended was just to make an imagined experience that felt true to my lived experience. And it's almost sort of after the fact that I realized that this place and this time in history, the 1990s, was much, much more relevant than I had sort of thought it was when I was involved in sort of more the pure pleasure of making a coherent fictional experience.
I mean, it's interesting that there's like a genre of the boarding school novel.
Yes.
Because they're not common places. They are not experiences that many people at all have. And yet there's sort of a world of these books. And I'm curious, like, if you thought about that as you were writing this and you thought, how do I fit within relationship to these other things that people have made and done?
Yeah, I definitely did think about it. I think I was lucky to have had some serious time between when I was writing this book and when I'd read, especially A Separate Piece and Catcher in the Rye and Old School. And I was happy not to have the influence of those books too much in this one. But I did think very much about why I was writing about this place and about these people. And I think at a very basic level, I was thinking about two dynamics. I think so many novels have been written about boarding school because it's a very small, concentrated world where there's no escape and everyone there cares intensely about some of the same things. And I think most of you here like and love and are involved in boarding schools specifically for, and independent schools in general, specifically for that concentration of intention and energy. And so I think that's why boarding schools make for really great fiction. They're a pressure cooker. And also I was very interested in kind of how this group of society sees itself, especially in this era. So I think when A Separate Piece was written, the security of Anglo-Americans in their leadership and power roles in America was much more sure. And I think the idea of having the metaphor of one student bouncing another student off of a branch kind of have resonance as large as, the world's actions in World War II felt like something that could work or be coherent. And so I knew that a lot had changed, and so I wanted to sort of, again, kind of dream my way into a newer and less secure kind of version of that world.
I mean, I think one thing the book takes up more than also the other set of boarding school novels is whiteness as an object of interest. And it's sort of an interesting moment where in the conversation about race more generally, it has this sort of character of thinking about whiteness and its power and simultaneous fragility. And we see some of that in the passage actually that you read where Alice is just imagining Ben and anticipating his future, and yet his tremendous, that is juxtaposed in that moment with his just profound anxiety and willingness to be deeply cruel to someone he's close to, in part, I think, because of that fragility. And I wondered if that was sort of, if whiteness was sort of a conscious decision that you made that you wanted to write about as you were working your way through this text.
Yeah, it was. And I think maybe I'm overstating the thing I keep repeating about having written a thing and then after the fact trying to find the coherence in it. I think I was, and I think I was specifically interested in investigating the, a friend of mine who grew up in Worcester, Massachusetts, and her family came to this country from Iran. She was sort of in a group where she could kind of see over the fence to schools like this, and imagined it as this place of ease, this place of, we're finally there, And I was very, and it was helpful to have her kind of crystallize what I think a lot of people feel about these schools. And so I think what I was most interested in is going into the point of view of someone who couldn't have arrived anymore, and still is so enmeshed in the system of everything will be okay on the other side of, and insert what on the other side of is a good SAT score, getting into one of these schools, getting into a really good college, getting a really good job, getting a promotion at that job, and that kind of forever, almost out of graspness was something that felt very, again, had a lot of juice in it and seemed a particular aspect of white institutions where for all outside viewers, there was something there to be envied. And at the same time, that permanent incompletion is something that that I just wanted to live with and watch twist around.
Yeah, it was. I think when I first read the book, which was just the sort of penultimate draft, it was like there were times where it was personally very difficult for me to read, in part because of the tremendous cruelty. There's a lot of love, but there's also there are these moments of just cruelty that don't explode into anything. They sort of dissipate, but they have a persistence to them. So the passage you just read was one, but there are many of them throughout the book. And when Alex and I went to St. Paul's together as 14 to 18-year-olds, there was tremendous cruelty. I mean, much more profound even than when I went back a decade later. And I kept thinking about this as like a theme of these spaces and a theme of their relationship to power, and how in the text you write about it, in the novel you write about it with a kind of, there's like a care, and they're never really huge, they're like dramatic moments that aren't particularly dramatized. And I thought about like why you wrote about cruelty in this way, or how as a theme it was something that you were working through. I also think there's another moment where, I'm not going to ruin the book, I don't think.
I'm not a big spoilers person.
Yeah.
Like everyone knows that everyone dies at the end of Hamlet. So I would say go spoil away.
Yeah, I mean, there's a moment where these two guys walk up and shave a strip through someone's head, and there's no fixing it, right? And it becomes a mark that he has to live with. And in some ways that he has to own and acknowledge, and that everyone knows about immediately, just as everybody knew immediately about the two servants who set up the room. Everyone knows immediately who did it, what they did, and then the question is, how do you live within this? And so, yeah, there are several moments throughout the book like this, and as well as there's sort of moments of these social cruelty, and then moments where people are really cruel to themselves. And I appreciated actually how these weren't overly dramatic or weren't, it wasn't a fetishization of it, but it seemed like just this persistent hum through the entire text.
Yeah, I want to sort of go in so many different directions from that. I think just from a storytelling point of view, a writer I recently met who put it a great way, that a lot of times the problem with certain fiction is pretending that certain things are more important than they are. And I think that there is a sense that a lot of us have, and I think a lot of what this book is about, that these characters feel like they should arrive and then it doesn't match up, and they feel a certain disappointment. And even with these elements of cruelty, to some degree, part of the fact that they do just happen and just keep going and aren't kind of shattering, life-changing events is sort of significant in itself. I wanted to talk more about the negative aspects of cruelty, but one thing that I kind of came to as I kept writing draft after draft is sometimes it seemed as though, you know, in other cultures and in other times in history, there's been a very ordered process for societies to help children transition into adults, and often they involve quite a bit of suffering. So there are people, for instance, in the South American rainforest who, as a rite of passage, put bullet ants into essentially a mitt and put it up to their elbow and have to keep the mitt on for a certain period of time. This is the most painful. It's kind of where you orient the most painful thing on scales of painful things. And so as I certainly think the cruelty in this book and the cruelty, especially the hazing things in this book, are failures, and failures really of many different kinds of systems. But in a certain other way, these are also students, I think, trying to very badly and with much malice, trying to create systems of meaning and systems of transition from childhood to adulthood, and are sort of grasping around for things, and the things they come to are very cruel and very crude. And I think that another dynamic of the kind of cruelty and suffering at places like this is, I think, an inversion of the ethos that is admirable that a lot of them have, which is there's a certain standard that we all should live up to. And we've agreed that that is a rightfully established standard. And I think a lot of the cruelty, and especially the self-cruelty, is punishment for not meeting a standard that is very different than the official one the school puts forth, but is still kind of supplied by the students themselves in certain ways. And I think that sort of ever-shifting standard, and something that can't ever be met up with, and the shame that exists when there's a permanent separation between what anyone can ever come to and a certain standard, that was something that felt very, very active in the real and imagined versions of this work.
There's a way, I mean, I really love the passage you selected because it catches up a bunch of the themes of privilege, precarity, but also these sort of distinction-making processes that are happening. And so it opens with sort of Alice, and she's has this critical lens on masculinity and on sort of whiteness and masculinity and privilege, which, you know, a future that Ben can't even see for himself, but she reads as destiny. And I think there's a very interesting sort of gendered lens there of what she's able to see. And then there is this critique of a distinction between wealth and class. And so you sort of see this, can you believe this guy showed up with 2 servants? And this represents a kind of like a demonstration of wealth that needs to be hidden at this institution. And then you have with Ben this like tremendous anxiety. It's not just of his body, but it's of his sort of collapsed social position, how he's not actually sure that he'll be able to be at school anymore, and what is going to happen to him as he's on this kind of like place that is anticipating this great upward trajectory, but his family is on this tremendous downward trajectory. And, you know, it sort of complicates the idea of, you know, the stability of power, that there's kind of a struggle that's going on between the kids to undermine wealth as the basis of their advantage and to suggest that it should be something else. But there's also this like sense of masculinity, its prowess, the importance of bodies, the ridiculousness of some guy who's unwilling to take his shirt off because his body is too full, and you know he doesn't quite represent the whiteness of the everyone else and the ways in which their bodies look. And I'm curious if you thought that you were writing a book about power and privilege, or if you thought you were just writing a book about this is, in some ways, I guess, even when I was writing my own book on these spaces, one of the common critiques I got was none of this is that unique. Right. The anxiety of belonging isn't that unique. Yep. The idea that kids create status distinctions and are mean to each other is not that unique. The fact that some people, are on these downward trajectories and, are dealing with that and live in a kind of closet of the anxiety of that. And so I constantly got this pushback of is this really a book about boarding school and elites, or is this just a book about what it means to be a 15-year-old?
Yeah, there's so many different ways to try to answer that. And I think in a certain way, those people may have been thinking about that as a critique, but in certain ways, they were having an insight that I think adds to the value of the book, which is, in a certain way, this is just what all people do, plus power and privilege and status, and a sort of centrality, and trying to constantly shore up that centrality. And so I don't think I set out kind of to write a fictional pamphlet about any of this, for sure. And I think that those kinds of novels are almost always bad. But I think, I did know that these schools were established with kind of a very interesting doubleness. So, in a certain way, they were established to do this exact kind of assimilation. So, in the 1880s, when a lot of these schools either were founded or came to their kind of current forms, their purpose was kind of to assimilate the newly wealthy Anglo-Protestant establishment, and to kind of establish a wider set of, to replace the kind of connections of family and clan with connections of school. So we used to be able to trust so-and-so because he was a Hawthorne, and now we can trust so-and-so because he's a Harvard man or a Groton man. And sort of that, so it was there was no mystery to that when I was starting to think about these schools. But the other side of that is really that they were also, I think, founded sincerely with the idea that there is a light in all human beings that should be nourished and cultivated. And so that contradiction, or that the way those two things kind of folded into each other, was just interesting. And I just wanted to get to the bottom of it a little bit more. And I think while I was there, it doesn't take a genius to look out at sort of the palace is not too strong a word for how intensely beautiful and sort of lavish the setting of St. Paul's is, and to know that this was in very stark opposition to how most schools were in the rest of the country. And I remember a friend of mine saying, yeah, but would you really rather have one more pencil sharpener in the classroom of every school in America, divide all the wealth that this place represents, and have one more pencil sharpener in every classroom in America? That seemed like a bit of it's point taken, I would say. But so I definitely didn't. Again, I didn't have a point of view and setting out to sort of propound that point of view. But I had always been sort of like a little bit vexed, or kind of, there was always a thing that was just, that wouldn't lie down. And so I just wanted to kind of keep getting underneath that thing that wouldn't lie down.
One last question, then I want to open it up. It's hard to get away from privilege, right? So we Alex and I walked in here and we were like, oh, this room looks a lot like St. Paul's. It's like the average room in St. Paul's looks exactly like this. No, literally.
And we were talking about the fact that there are, and forgive me because I want to not take up too much time for your question, but we were talking about the fact that literally there's a scene in the book where there are panels exactly like these that list the name of all the graduating students. And for students who are either related to many later students or alumni who are very famous, their names get shiny from all the fingers that go across them. And so the only thing missing in this room to make it look precisely like many rooms at St. Paul's is to have all of those names inscribed. So
yeah. And I was thinking like, two things. One, we both ended up writing books to more or less degree about St. Paul's or about this experience we had. And I think, knowing you pretty well, like neither of us were particularly happy there. Like it wasn't like either of us were looking to reclaim the glory of high school. In fact, I was very happy to leave high school. And I kind of thought I would never go back. And it's interesting the decision to sort of like to do that, but also the sort of I'm a pretty good sociologist, but the perpetuation of privilege is real. Like we get to sit here and pontificate for 45 minutes and have all these like smart, interesting people listen to us as a sort of continuation of some of the dynamics of privilege. And I wonder, like, do you struggle with that? Do you think through it? This might be. Alex and I go on long walks together, and they're like kind of shared therapy sessions.
Yeah, of course, and it's not it's not lost on me also being a white guy sitting up here as well. And I think though that I also my palms sweat every time I went back to St. Paul's, even as a spring term senior, at the same time, this character of Alice. So this is just a small example, but so many of these schools have had sex scandals in the last forever, but there's many of them just coming out now, both between students and faculty and students, and that is truly the case that there is very poisonous sexism at work, and at the same time. That character of Alice just kind of arrived with me in a way that I don't think could have happened unless I had developed the friendships with women that I was able to in that kind of setting. And it is not at all to say that the way that school was in terms of gender, let's say, was an ideal endpoint. At all, but St. Paul's was also one of the first, if not the first, to be co-ed, and I think that alongside those really entrenched, really difficult problems, is a kind of intimacy and is a kind of closeness and care and a community of care, and so again, it's one of these double things where. It is truly an intimate community of care that the boundaries around which just could not be higher in terms of how much money it takes to get in, how much money it takes to sustain those schools, et cetera. So that's just one example of how that doubleness is. And of course, here we sit, beset with privilege. And as Nicole said in the introduction, what these schools, I think, most highly aspire to is leadership. And the very difficult and always decaying aspect of leadership is that once a group starts to lead, they start diverting more and more of their energy and assets into securing that position. But does that invalidate the value of leadership, the value of and this is like painful ways of putting this. I just finished, again, this book, The Protestant Establishment by E. Digby Baltzell. And, is inherent privilege that comes with leadership worth the positive aspect of that, which is certain select individuals making difficult choices and bringing along with them a larger group that is debating whether or not to go through difficult things and be led through difficult things. I cannot tell you how hesitant I am to say that I and we sitting here should be playing that role. And And I think looking directly at what goes into creating that role and sustaining it, looking at it, seeing exactly how it works, living in it, and even lavishing attention and care on it, and not trying to look away from it, not trying to pretend it doesn't exist, not trying to deny that it's there, and having it being willing to have it change, and being willing to have to not continually grasp for it to be the same. I truly don't know, but that seems like the most energetic way of contending with it.
Great, I want to open it up. I can't see you guys because there's a light directly in my eyes, so I see the light. So if your hand is up, I don't know, just start talking, or wait maybe for Nicole to come around and thank you.
Hi, I'm Aaron Pallas at TC.
I don't know if it's on.
Hi, maybe I'll just talk loud. My teacher's voice. So Alex and Shamus, you both had a shared experience as students at St. Paul's. And then Alex, you spent the better part of a decade writing a novel, presumably drawing on your experience. Shamus returned to the school to do systematic sociological research. I was struck by how early in the passage you read, you used the term ease, which is a term that's very central and recurring in Shamus's analysis. So I'm wondering if there are ways in which your writing of the book engaged with Shamus's work.
Such a good question. And I still remember the room I was in when I was reading Galleys of Privilege. You know, one of the things about writing a book is that things that you're not even aware of get drawn up in sort of the, you know, eddies and disaster of trying to write a book. But definitely, I think that Shamus's book definitely got me to look again at, I think, the things that I'd heard so many times, sort of like, sure, you know, it's an education that teaches you how to think, let's say. How many times did I hear that growing up where, sure, you're not specializing in everything, but you're learning how to think. And so, yes, definitely. I you know, and I picked this passage because I was sort of like, oh man, I feel like this could have been sort of right from an interview with a student, you know, who had been in, you know, featured in Privilege.
There's a Jesus rock.
Is there?
Yeah, not in Privilege, but at St. Paul's.
Oh yeah, exactly. So the Jesus rock is an actual feature of this particular pond.
I've stood on it before.
Yes.
As have you, I'm sure.
Yeah. But definitely. So that book got me thinking again about things that I had sort of glossed over and sort of glazed over in my lived experience. Definitely.
There's also, if you're interested, read more about Paul's Black Eyes.
Yes.
Oh man. Which is a total masterpiece. 100%.
When in Rome. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is again to acknowledge my ignorance and lack of preparation in a certain way that I think it was necessary to some degree to write my own version of this. Is you know, so many brilliant books have been written about this world and in general that I sort of had to exclude so that I could listen to the sometimes feeble you know, voice that I was trying to listen to.
Another question. Okay, well, we're recording it, so it would be.
Hello.
Oh.
Hi, I'm Evelyn. I'm class of 2010 from St. Paul's. And I have two questions. First, is the Jesus rock the dam?
So this is something that is so interesting to me. So I had always assumed that the Jesus rock was something that had been handed down time immemorial and so on. So the dam is further out. Sorry, this is going to get inside baseball, but I'll try to relate it to sort of general thing. So dam is further out, but right off the main boat dock, if you really go like kind of due northwest,
Yep.
you'll run into this thing, and it is just this crazy. You know, I wonder if it was even placed
I don't know.
It's not,
It is a rock
exists,
in the
and
middle, and
next time you go back, look
but you
for it.
you would have to like want to swim out towards the hockey center in order to get to it. And halfway there's a small rock that is about the size of a refrigerator that you can stand upon.
And so this is tedious for everyone who didn't go to St. Paul's, but I think it sort of speaks to a larger thing, which is kind of the importance of, and sometimes recency of what seem like eternal traditions, you know? So the student, the main character of the book has a brother who just graduated, and everything that the brother did was sort of more epic and more, you know, it just like, wow, that's the way the real school was. And I remember feeling that way about students who were there before me, and that they must have handed down the Jesus rock from generation to generation. And then I remember going back for my 10th year reunion and having everyone be like, man, it was the real school when you were there. And that sort of constant, you know, we think about tradition in terms of the wood panels and the names and the chapels and so on. But I think that sort of recency tradition dynamic also really happens at a school that turns over every 4 years. And sometimes I think can lead to a certain lockstep like atmosphere. I sense that you had a second part of your question.
So my second question is just given, I mean, this school has changed so much. And obviously with the sex scandals that have happened recently, are you optimistic about St. Paul's and similar institutions and about their future?
Oof, I sometimes feel totally unqualified. You know, I don't think there's an organization out there that doesn't have what seem like completely terminal flaws. You know, St. Paul's in particular seems to have them, you know. But again, I just, there, especially in an age of atomization, you know, everyone goes to their little cubicle, goes home to their little apartment. You know, faith communities have eroded in so many ways. You know, the kind of social clubs that I think were such a characteristic of American culture for so long have kind of eroded away. And I think there are some things that are emerging to fill that gap. And I don't know whether a place like St. Paul's can provide a model for a place that is that intentional and that intimate, but isn't so laden with inequality. And, you know, St. Paul's has $700 million in its endowment. And if it lost $100 million, it would still have $600 million in its endowment. But everyone in the fundraising committee would be clutching their skulls about the cataclysm of having lost $100 million. You know, and so that seems pretty hard to surmount. And at the same time, if people from St. Paul's know what it feels like to have a community of intimacy like that and can try to create it in a less gated way, maybe that's something. So the answer is I really have no idea. It doesn't. But you know, I also you know, I think one of the other things is I'm so interested to talk to you all because it's easy for me to sit over here and be like, these schools and da da da. But I would have no idea how to approach running these very complicated and precarious institutions. And I tried to do some work, I think, in the book depicting the dilemmas of some of the administration who are, you know, they've got to meet fundraising totals, they've got to meet college admissions stuff, they've got to make sure the papers don't get wind of stuff that they can handle in a more nuanced way. And so, man, it's hard. As you all can tell me better than I can say it.
So we can take one more question, then we're going to head down the hall for a reception.
And continue the conversation.
And continue the conversation. Yes.
So it's funny because as I read your book and it starts with the hazing kind of thing in the basement, and I immediately went back to, I'm a product of boarding schools and those kind of things happening. So, and you both have spoke up there about kind of not being exactly happy. So I'm curious.
I projected that on him, but
you did a little bit.
It was an accurate projection.
Okay. I was also not that happy, but I go back So there's this kind of magnetism, and in alumni bodies, some people cut bait and run, right? That's like 10 to 20% just leave, never talk again about it. But then most, even the truly happy or the truly miserable, come back. And I'm curious what pulled you back, if you could kind of put your finger on it, or the multiple things.
I wouldn't mind hearing from Shamus.
Yeah, I think it was there were a series of experiences at St. Paul's that were part of a political awakening for me. And we had different experiences at this school, in part because of where I lived, which was in one of the 2 dorms where the Black and Latino students lived. And it was very kind of isolated. It was dramatic. If you open up the yearbook from the 90s, there's this just tremendous segregation. And that had a big impact on me and drove me to be super interested in inequality, which wasn't really something I was interested in when I got there. I was from a well-off family that was a professional family. So both of my parents grew up in subsistence farming villages, but I grew up in a house with a nurse and a surgeon as parents. So, wealthy, not by St. Paul's standards by any means, but by any American standard would be considerably wealthy. And that wealth was not visible to me really, in part because my parents liked to, they kind of concealed it a little bit. Not that they didn't like drive an Audi, but like they didn't expose me to any kind of politics. And so at St. Paul's, I had like this political awakening, but no way to make sense of it because I didn't have teachers who would talk to me about it. So I had teachers who would talk to me about like Dante. And, I was a classical honors scholar. So I was like a Latin and Greek kid and in lots of advanced math classes, and it's pretty dorky.
I can neither confirm nor deny.
And then I sort of had this political awakening, and the story that I tell about this in sociological audiences is like a very intellectual one. It's that I became aware of patterns of inequality, that inequality was being primarily driven by wealth, and that very little work was being done on this. And so I was like, I have this perfect opportunity to deal with this. The story I told when I finished my dissertation, though, was a very different story. And I think they both have an element of truth to it, which is that my parents spent a lot of time developing in me a series of skills that they didn't have, that I think they thought prevented them from advancing in ways that would have been meaningful for them, which meant a lot of like development of a lot of like culture. So so I sometimes think about the fact that I went back to this school to write that book was in some ways a study of the distance between me and my parents, and a way for me to kind of reckon with and think through these elite spaces that they had aspired to place me within. And then in this sort of more personal sense, what it meant, because I lived in Andover, Massachusetts, and could have been a day student at Andover and chose to go to St. Paul's, which was very upsetting to my parents. And so what it meant that I had produced this distance and they had produced this distance, and how I might grapple with it.
Yeah. It's very interesting that you talk about a political awakening there, because I also had one. It was for very obvious reasons quite different. So when our first year, or the year that I arrived at St. Paul's was the first year of a new rector, he was very unpopular for ways that aren't necessarily interesting here. But I think in a certain way that is interesting, he, part of the reason why he was driven out was his alleged firing of a teacher and spiritual leader that everyone suspected was gay. And I mean, more than that, though, people just thought he was kind of a nerd and a killjoy, and so they forced him out. But it was a very bracing period that felt like a crusade in a certain way. And that word is obviously pretty freighted. But it just felt like things really mattered. It felt like something was hanging in the balance that was very, very important, even in retrospect when I look back and I think to myself, not as important as I thought, necessarily. But I think, to Shamus's point, I also was very interested in the way that I was led into appreciation of art and literature and culture in a way that I felt connected to in a very true and sincere way. But there was always an overlay of status, and if you've read these books, then you have sort of more authority, And there was like, I almost felt myself fighting back and forth between what felt like a sincere connection of human minds and if you've read more books, then you've got more status. And that kind of like way of feeling, that I don't think, it's not the style of assimilation that you're talking about, but I think almost felt like if I had command of this, and this, then I would sort of have that same control. And so that disconnect felt strange in a way I wanted to go back and look at. And also, it just felt like a very wild and unpredictable place, and a very uncontrolled place in a way that I have never been ever anywhere similar. And so when unpredictable things that could happen, where there were big like consequences, and I'm talking like people going to swim at the dam at 1 a.m. and someone potentially falling to their death, where like that sort of almost anarchy was seeming to happen. There's something that is very intoxicating about that. And in the much more controlled environments of college and working a job and paying my rent and so on, that sort of like grandeur and mystery held a lot of sway, I think, in my imagination.
So we're going to press pause and just head down the hall to Elliott Lounge for reception. But I want to thank you, Alex and Shamus, for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.